Okay, so in the last session, we talked about how Daoism impacted on the Chinese arts and music with cited stories, historical stories. Um, if the Chinese art so established its relationship with Mother Nature and on the way to develop its own format and of course the aesthetic value, uh, the whole theory and the methodology, as far as the music and art goes, um, which is basically, like I pointed out, the Chinese elite arts basically was not about, oh, this is the arts, this is the artwork, basically I created so people appreciate in the basically they pay for a certain commercial value or promote, like in the Western or European art history, basically either, uh, there's nothing wrong with that, but, the function was actually, praise the Lord, and of course that glorified the church, and everything. Or, for the monarch, basically the divine power, why it was all legitimate and all that. It was not about that. The Chinese music, poetry, or let's say calligraphy arts, or the landscape in particular genre, they were all basically a means of self-improvement study. It shows where you are at the level of improvement. So when you are, and this does not always necessarily, have to be associated with the age, but when time goes on, you have been trying to improve yourself in the studies in the sense of kung fu. Remember, we talked about kung fu is basically in Chinese the two Chinese character or kanji about time to spend, and over these decades, you improved yourself through all the studies. You studied Daoism, you studied Zen, and then you also study Confucianism, which is basically part of the craft you have to have when you are a royal court official. That's how you do your daily business with. But in your private life, what's Tao? I mean, basically, you just stick with Taoism because that's the thing cultivates your mind, and so you become a good artist, good musician. And it's not because, oh, I'm gonna perform for other people. One is for you to do the study. You kind of make sense out of it, and you connect through this artistic meaning, or means actually, rather. And then when you kind of communicate with your friends or your fellow court officials of different ranks, and typically in old days, the Chinese elites, they do the social party among themselves. That's what secondary residence was for, because the primary residence, just like communist China today, the government provide all that supposedly. If you're part of the system on the royal court payroll, the court actually will allocate the residence, provide that for you, which is adequate, with your rank on the royal court payroll. Each time you got promoted, they give you a different residence, and you don't have any property rights over it, but it just provide properly for you. So that's the part you don't have to pay per se, but that's part of the etiquette protocol, right? Reflect the Chinese, I guess, hierarchy. So now, if you're at certain, I guess, level within the hierarchy, and you somehow manage the resource to be able to have your own secondary residence somewhere, that'll be where you host a party. But that's not just to get high together. You get high, but then that alcohol is really to, cultivate your artistic creativeness. So all this, poetry, and then the calligraphy, and then this, ink brush painting, everything just come out. Okay, so that's recording the state of mind at that time. So some court officials were more talented than others, and then they became more emerged, you know. So it was not all about your rank in the royal court. No, it's about, my goodness, look at that painting. But is it about the ink brush technique? Not really. That kung fu helps, but what it is, you're showing that state of mind. So in the old Chinese painting, there was this thing everybody knew about. It's called, when you begin to learn the Chinese landscape genre ink brush painting, you look at a mountain, you see mountain. Yeah, that's just for the beginner. But then when you improve yourself, okay, through studies, your state of mind, you get a little deeper, and then you look at the mountain. You don't see mountain. What do you see? That means the context begin to change. So you don't just replicate a mountain from Mother Nature on your paper, rice paper back then, but you see something else. So you put a little more philosophical touch to it, and that is only, the level that's a little higher than the beginner level. But then eventually, you look at a mountain, okay, you see mountain again. Is that returning back to the old? No. Because you don't, if you are a good Taoist, which if you're a good Chinese artifact, then you have to be a good Taoist, because otherwise you don't get the whole thing, right? So if you're a good Taoist and you were doing this landscaping, right, you see a mountain, after you look at a mountain, this time is different from the beginner level. This time is like, a mountain is a mountain, but more importantly, how that mountain is there, okay, subject to the environment surrounding the mountain, and how does that relate to the Mother Nature, okay? The mountain used to be a sea, and now it's a mountain. So all that, up and down, rise and sink, this geological, formation came and went. All that, right? So now you're still painting a mountain, but with that, all clear here. Do you really care? Oh, this part, it doesn't really resemble, or that part, it's not. No, you free yourself. You free your mind, and you go, and that is so, like, almost, looking so casual. Based on what? Decades of Kung Fu. Your technique is there. But if you're always there, confined to that little state of mind, and your techniques, you really care about, this, that, you're never going to be a greatest, artist. No. So it's not about the technique. Kung Fu is very important in the Chinese art and everything else, but if you stick with Kung Fu, you don't rise above that Kung Fu, you didn't get to, basically learn what is the essence, at core. Kung Fu is just the means to get you, where's the end? The state of mind. Free your mind. That's what Taoism, would help if you really look, deep into it. So we talk about the arts, right? And how does that, I guess, help for the Chinese artists in old days? Not today. Okay, not today. You go look at the Chinese arts today. A lot of them, I want to say they pretty much just stay with technique, and they cut corners even, for techniques. So, yeah, that's why I'm a Chinaman. I'm not a Chinese. So anyway, the arts, right? The Taoism in the arts, how, you see, remember, that was all about the arts and the Mother Nature. What about landscaping? When you look at the British landscaping, when you look at the Japanese landscaping, what do you see? You see the human touch everywhere, all the shapes and forms. Where did that come from as far as the British? You trace back to Louis the 14th, okay? That was the guy defined the European civilization, right? With all that sophisticated, etiquette protocols. That's the European civilization. Louis the 14th taught the whole European monarchs across the region what is the proper protocol when you throw a party, right? The way you act, the way you talk, the way you dress, everything. That's European civilization, for you. Before Louis XIV, they were in the dark ages, right? So what did they know about the arts, the literature, the music, the architecture, the landscaping? There's your big brother, Louis XIV, the talented guy. He did not have a military mind, but he conquered, the people in his own country, all the nobilities that used to be, rebellious before his time, his parents, grandparents, all the way back, up. He conquered first his own state and then Europe with his etiquette protocols, right? That was the European art for you. Of course, the Renaissance, before this French, of course they were there. But the more sophisticated European civilization was pretty much defined by the Sun King himself. You have to give it to the guy, right? Now, what about the Chinese, right? So we mentioned that the Japanese took a lot of things from China back then, but they took a spin. But there was a reason for it. If you go to visit the western part of Japan, which in Japanese they call Kansai, Kansai was originally a certain historical period in Japan where the royal court and then the shogunate government, pretty much was later on the somewhat eastern side, where Tokyo is today located. But the royal court of the Japanese emperors and nobility, they were basically on the west side of Japan. And you go there, that's where Kyoto is located, and you could still see some, preserved, I guess, cultural heritage, which probably, if you want to see the old Japan, that's the best place to go, right? Kyoto. You go to China, you don't see much left because it's all revolutionized, it's all westernized. Where's the traditional Chinese architecture? Go to Shanxi province. 73% of the ancient Chinese architecture is still preserved only in that province. But the rest of China, not much left. Whereas you go to Japan, you go to Kyoto. So when you compare the one in Shanxi province of China and the ones in Kyoto, what do you see? Big difference. A lot of Chinese tend to believe, we go to Japan, they mean Kyoto. We see old China. Oh, I'm sorry, that's not old China. Because what happened here, the Japanese Buddhism was started by the Chinese monks. There were some Chinese monks were invited by the Japanese and went there, but more because they, after the Manchurians invaded China, some of them went to Japan, and then before that, after the Mongolians invaded China, some monks went to Japan. Basically, refugees somehow, religious refugees, and they helped, founded the Buddhism in Japan. So those monks, they brought the Chinese culture to Japan, further enhanced. Funny the way it came out. The Confucianism, actually, the Japanese picked up from the monks. So in Japan, Buddhism actually just accidentally slipped. And it's been, this Confucianism out among the Japanese samurai, well, not samurais, but shogun or samurais that worked for the shoguns. And it's been out the Bushido. Okay, so do you expect the monks of Buddhism that arrived in Japan slipped out the Confucianism? Do you expect them to pump out a lot of Daoism? Of course not. Of course not. So this is this solid evidence and explanation where and how the Japanese landscaping so different from the Chinese original. Okay, why they're different? Because the philosophy is totally different. Okay, you go to Kyoto and you go to you visit all those Zen. I think they call it in Japanese, call it Zenji, meaning the temples or shrines of Zen, religion. You go there and then you go to the back court, okay, of those temples or Zenji or Zen shrines. You go in there and then you see it does look pretty. It does look beautiful. A lot of it you can actually relate to the Chinese poetries and paintings. But here's the problem. They look like painting. They don't look like lands. Of course, given the size of the, the backyard, the court of a Zenji, they're not that big. But they want to pack everything in there so it looks so fake. It looks pretty, but it's fake. That's the major difference between the Japanese landscaping and the Chinese landscaping, because in the Chinese court, where the it doesn't matter if it's the royal court or it's just some nobility court or some Chinese intellectual. We talk about the Chinese elite. In Chinese, the word gentleman does not or did not refer to as in Europe, like those nobility. No, Chinese gentlemen were the one that were the elites I was talking about a little earlier, the credentialed court officials. Those were gentlemen. Okay, so gentlemen had their secondary residence basically, landscape. But here's the difference. They have to look like, even though there's a lot of maintenance and there's a lot of labor put into it, they have to look like it's it's part of the nature. It has always been like that for the last 1,000 years. That's criteria. That's the one the Japanese don't have. Never had, and never. They never had and never have now. So I'm not in English, I guess, mode today. But anyway, that's the major difference. Okay, when it comes to landscaping. So when you design a Chinese garden, which I just did, okay, you want to make it look like it has always been there. It has to look beautiful. And also another thing the Japanese never got, and I don't blame them, they got everything from the monks. And the monks don't practice those things. That is, what came out from Hong Kong like a couple of decades ago. The British got it from Hong Kong and then spread word around Europe and then came to the United States, called feng shui, right? Feng shui was part of the whole thing. That's in Chinese called the kan yu xue, okay? The science of balance. What balance that? The yin and the yang, the two forces, work in the infinity, right? And that is the essence of Daoism, the deep roots of the Daoism. So when you design a Chinese garden, the first thing first is the balance of yin yang, okay? So you have 4 directions, okay? So in each direction, what does it mean? What goes here and there and why? Everything has a very, very sophisticated theory there. And do you think the Chinese architect and landscape designer today actually care about those things? Not really. I mean, you don't believe me? Go take a look. If you keep tuning in, I will tell you everything about it. Okay, the arts, the landscape, the architecture. The Chinese had everything different from today, the westernized China. Okay, the way they still perceive the westernized. So when the West is still talking about, oh, Chinese value, yeah, where's the Chinese value in China today? That's a good question, right? So back to the point. If you understand all that, especially about the Daoism, how that, everything, around it, you go to Japan, you don't see China. Not at all. It's just a spin off of the original Chinese version with a lot of things missed and a lot of other things localized. Of course, Buddhism came from India and took a spin in China, mixed with the Confucianism, and that becomes the Chinese Buddhism, right? And it went to Japan, went to Korea, went to Vietnam. There, that became East Asia for you. So we talk about landscape, which I probably will talk a little more in the next session, but in this session, we have to wrap it up right here. But basically, I think you already figured out. Before we actually talk about the characters, the sentence of that book, what I'm doing, I'm giving you the cultural environment, restoring to the times when and where this thing came out, okay? Because if the Chinese who were born, raised in China, probably never set their food outside China, they speak Chinese, they read Chinese, and they don't know anything about it. And you don't even speak Chinese or read Chinese for that matter. Don't you think you need a little relevance, So instead of just talking about those abstract words, and I'm just translating from the ancient Chinese, to English, just like, some Chinese scholars translate from ancient Chinese to contemporary Chinese. A lot got lost in the translation in China. I don't want to make that mistake. I want you to understand why there is this Daoism today. Where did it come from, right? That is my approach. If you have some comments, leave the comments, okay? Until next session, ciao.